Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Daniel G. Newman, who is the president and co-founder of MapLight.org. He has also recently released and published a book called Unchecked, How to Fix Our Broken Democracy. And that is exactly what we are going to speak about today. But if you're new here and to this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to speak about how we can defend democracy, focused on the US. And I'm so excited for this interview and I really want to learn more. So Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure.
All right, so let's jump straight into it. But before we do, could you speak a little bit about MapLight and the work that you guys are doing before we get into the problem?
Sure. MapLight is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. I started it 15 years ago, and we expose money's influence on politics and fight online political deception in the US.
Okay. So let's dive into those problems then. Let's start. What do you think is the biggest problems for democracy in the US?
I think that the biggest problems is that there's a group of people that really don't want a modern, inclusive democracy. And this is a small group of millionaires and billionaires known as the Koch network, sometime with Charles and David Koch, the leaders. And in my book Unchecked, I call them the wealth hoarders. And this represents only a tiny minority of the US and only a tiny minority of wealthy people. But they have this idea that everybody is out for themselves, and I've already got mine. I'm really wealthy, they think, and they don't want to pay taxes to support anybody else. So, fine for them to have this extreme libertarian ideas. It's good to have diversity of opinion, but the problem is they have been rigging the political system over the last 50 years to be bent more and more toward their point of view, which is that wealth should control government instead of the people controlling government.
Okay, so how are they doing that? How are they using the money to control the system?
So if you want to run for office in the US, you need money to run your campaign. And the number one place to get that money is from the industries that want something from government. So if you're elected to Congress, you may have to raise money from banks and from pharmaceutical companies and from oil companies. And then once you get elected, you're dependent on those companies and you have to make laws that favor them or you're not going to get the money to get reelected. Now, there's plenty of people who run for office who don't think like this, that are citizen-powered candidates instead of corporate-powered candidates, but it's very hard for those people to win because they simply can't get the money to run for office. Now, I'm a fan of publicly funded elections, which you have in a few areas of the US and also many other countries, so that candidates can run for office and win using funds from the government, so that then when they're elected, they don't have any special favors to pay back. The people that want to, the wealth hoarders that want the system to run by money, want to make sure that they can give as much as possible to their own candidates. So you had Sheldon Adelson, a very wealthy business person in the US and a major donor to candidates who recently passed away. He would write checks for $10 million, $20 million to the favorite presidential candidates, for example. So what kind of influence does that person have over policy? A huge amount. And that pattern is repeated with many, many special interests and extremely wealthy people. So the wealth hoarders have brought court cases to the Supreme Court, influence the makeup of the Supreme Court and other courts, so that these court decisions more and more have allowed unlimited money. And this came to a head about 20 years ago in 2010 with this infamous Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United versus FEC, which says that any person or corporation can give an unlimited amount of money to spend in support of a political candidate. And so that the more that big money can control who gets elected, the less control we, the people, have, and the less the laws favor the people versus the wealthy people.
And I see what a huge problem and threat this is to democracy. So what can be done then to protect the system, to unrig the system?
Yeah, so there's many things that can be done, and there's no one silver bullet, but all of these are important. So number one, making it transparent where the money comes from. So right now you can have dark money, which is secret money in politics. You can spend millions of dollars to support your favorite candidate, and you can do it without anyone knowing. So that means, for example, in one U.S. state, you had in Wisconsin, you had the governor elected with secret money. It turned out some of that came from a company that made lead paint, and then the legislature of that state passed a law to give less liability to lead paint manufacturers and let them off the hook for the harm they caused. Like no one would have known about this at all. It so happened some documents got leaked in that particular case. But that's the kind of horrible influence that secret money has on our process. It's like we as the public don't even know who's doing the influencing and the effect it's having. So making all this money transparent is one. Having public funding of elections is a second one, so that people can run for office without special interest money. And the third one is expanding voting, because there's a major effort by the wealth hoarder interests to make it harder and harder for people to vote. You have to have certain kinds of documentation to vote. The closing polling places, so they're only open smaller hours in African American communities and low income communities. So really trying to distort the election results to favor the people who want wealth. So those are a few examples of the types of strategies that can help. And actually, there are people all around the country putting these strategies into effect. And those are some of the people I profile in my book on RIG as well.
Mm. And I guess this must have been some of the more action-packed months in politics ever for you guys that are fighting for a just voting system. So what is your perspective on what happened with the latest election and all the accusations of voter fraud and the after effects?
So the U.S. has had this self-perception for decades that we are special in the world, that like we have like a special democracy, a light to other countries, and to some extent that has been true, that we provided some inspiration over the years. But in terms of the specialness of the U.S., like in this regard, I think that was really shattered over these last months when you had problems just like other democracies face, where you have leaders who want to be authoritarian leaders spreading lies. You have those inciting violence. You have a lack of trust in the very basic fundamentals of democracy. Is like, will I be able to vote? Will the person who gets the most votes gets elected? And will that person have a peaceful transfer of power? So I think one of the things that you've seen in the U.S. is this kind of leveling and awareness in the U.S. of how important the basic systems of democracy are. I'm certainly very sad about all the lies that have spread and the violence that have occurred. At the same time, I do hope it's a wake-up call for all of us here in the US to think we really need to work on the fundamental systems of a democracy, the shared agreements that we all need to have to make our country run better, because the failure of those things has been so apparent.
Yeah, it's been close to taking the basic right of democracy away from the people. And maybe it's a wake-up call that, I mean, democracy is not even that old of a thing. It's a quite new invention. So it really needs defending. Now, you also spoke about that you're fighting to stop the spread of misinformation in social media. Like, I that don't know so much about it, I don't know, like, how could you do that? I don't know what is the effect of Trump's Twitter account being shut down, and is that going to have maybe even more backfire effects? So I would love to learn what you know about that.
Yeah, well, so far the evidence is that Trump's Twitter account getting shut down has actually reduced disinformation all over the web. One of the things we're looking at MapLight is the paid political activity of actors spreading false information. So beyond just the politicians, like like for example, the Russian attacks on the 2016 election were based on spreading false information. You have both domestic and foreign actors in the US trying to do the same thing, like manipulate public opinion. In Florida, for example, there was all sorts of misinformation in Spanish language that had lies about Joe Biden during the presidential election. Now, all those things someone is paying for them, and they're not necessarily advertisements, but they are people that are being paid to put out this false information. And so one of the strategies we're pursuing is to get a law passed to have true transparency for all paid political activity. Like, social media is obviously a new medium, but the basic democratic principles haven't changed with the introduction of newspapers and radio and television. All these medias had political manipulation attempts. One of the helpful things has been to have transparency to who is paying for them. And so when you see political ads on television, you will see fine print at the bottom, voiceover saying who paid for the ad. You can go to a government database and look up who paid for the ad. Like, that kind of transparency we need for all paid political activity on social media. Everyone who's being paid to blog for the benefit of our campaign then should have to disclose where the money comes from.
I hadn't even thought of it that way. That it's one thing if Trump says something, but then a lot of people are re-saying what he's saying, and they're being paid to do so. And yeah, that's really interesting. Now, but couldn't there be a backfire effect then of shutting him down, even though if there's less paid information out there? Couldn't it be that it just adds power and momentum to maybe conspiracy theories, and yeah, people might even get there. They might look at it as an affirmation that, yeah, it is rigged against us.
So I think that the conspiracy theories are, like, by design, are designed to thrive based on whatever is happening or isn't happening. So it's not clear to me that actions to actually rein in incitements to violence, like Trump was doing, would create more conspiracy theories, because the conspiracy theories are already there. I think one thing to look at is the micro targeting of political ads. So what that means is, like, around election time, for example, ads that you can target on using Facebook and other platforms to even just a small handful of voters, even that say, oh, election day is on Wednesday, not Tuesday, which is false, or information to try to discourage them from going to the polls. And this is called voter suppression, and it's been around in the US for hundreds of years, especially targeted African American communities. This is a modern form of it, is targeting those communities with messages to try and convince them not to go to the polls. That kind of micro-targeting, I think, should be illegal. And I think other companies need to be forced to do what Google has taken some positive steps in this regard. For political ads, you can only target down to the zip code level or age level. You can't target like individual small groups of users. If you do that, like you can do on Facebook, it's non-transparent. Like, no one actually knows what's going on. No one knows what messages are being delivered. And so all this, like, lying and voter suppression can take place without any accountability or transparency.
Yeah, so there's a lot of responsibility on the big tech giants then. So what needs to change them for them to start taking actions toward being more transparent?
The government passing laws and regulations. I mean, there are some great efforts right now to put pressure on the companies, like a coalition that MapLight's part of called Stop Hate for Profit, to try to get these companies to do a better job of stopping hate speech and have more transparent information. But ultimately, the government needs to force them to do it. So we, the people, have to say enough is enough. This is destroying our democracy, and it has to stop.
And does that include if someone is telling obvious lies, for example, on social media? And like, should there be filters towards that from your point of view?
I think really we start with some of the basic things like incitements to violence, hate speech. Let's do a good job of screening out those. I mean, we have a far way to go. We need transparency for who's speaking. So a lie is not going to be as compelling to people if people know that it's paid for by the Russian government or it's paid for by a particular political party. So I'm of the idea that let's put the source of these ads up there. It's not about like deciding what's a lie and what's not. It's really about making sure that people know who is speaking so they can evaluate the information for themselves.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good first step. So moving forward, then, what would you hope we would collectively accomplish in the next 10 years to defend our democracy?
Well, I think just to shore up every piece of it, first of all, awareness that like democracy is not something that like fixes itself, and that there are people actively out there seeking to attack it and make democracy work less well. So that means at the state level and the local level, as well as the national level, expanding voting rights, number one, anti-gerrymandering, which it means letting citizens decide the voting districts instead of politicians deciding and drawing them in squiggly ways so that they can choose their own voters. Getting big money out of politics by having public funding elections. And another one is the ending the electoral college. So the electoral college is this convoluted system that America has to choose the president, where the voters don't choose the president directly. They choose the electors who choose the president. This creates a situation where you have Joe Biden winning the presidency, maybe by relatively modest amount of votes across several states, across swing states, but huge, winning by 7 million votes in the popular vote. Or in the case of like Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, but losing the presidency. So these are undemocratic outcomes. That's an undemocratic outcome.
Yeah.
It's a relic of when the country was set up almost 250 years ago, and it needs to be fixed. And if we can fix that, we'll have not only a president that actually represents most of the people every time, but we'll have an investment in civic participation across the country. It won't be the only dozen swing states in the US that get all the attention, political attention of the president, but every vote in every state will matter, and it will be a huge force to engage everyone in improving our country.
Yeah, you must be so frustrated being in a state where your vote matters less because of this system. So would you think it's realistic that that system is changing in the near future?
I do. There's a movement called National Popular Vote. It's a website of the same name and organization that step by step has been using this system called interstate compact, which means they get states to agree to award all their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote nationally. I know that sounds kind of technical, but it basically means like once enough states decide that to join this agreement, this compact, then the election will the next presidential election after that will be by popular vote and not by electoral vote. And they're already have about half the electoral votes needed to get there. So it's not going to happen this year, but like progress is being made.
Mm. That makes me real happy to hear. So imagine someone is listening to this. They feel a sense of injustice and a bit of anger, and at the same time inspired to make some part of contribution to make the world more democratic. What can they do to have a positive impact?
Yeah, so the number one solution to that is join a group, join with other people that are already working to fix our broken democracy. This is not something you can do by yourself. It's something you do with other people. On my website, unrigbook.com, I have a list of groups in each state, and that you can find out who's working on this group in your state or in your local area, who's working on fixing democracy. State governments in the US have a lot of power, and including power over most elections. And so you can join with other people that are trying to fix the system and help make it happen.
Beautiful. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. I learned so much in this conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this as much as I did, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithms that this conversation is important, so more people can learn about what steps we need to take to fix the broken democracy. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is great.com to learn more.